My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute. I blog at creativitydiscourse.com. I review movies from a mythological point of view at cinemadiscourse.com. And you can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. I'm talking today about visionary creativity. So let's start with a fragment of a quote from the English Romantic poet Shelley. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And we'll go further than that, and we'll see how visionary creatives actually make the world in which we live. So let's start with one of those grabber questions. What do Michelangelo and Mark Zuckerberg have in common? So we can guess from the title of our talk today that they are both visionary creatives. But let's see what we mean by that. And we start with the notion that Michelangelo didn't only make magnificent sculpture, but he made a world. He made a notion of what human beings are. He and other artists and poets of his time. So here we have Michelangelo's David, and we see the Renaissance humanist self, the notion of the human being as a physical as well as spiritual and psychological being. And then on the right, something very different. You notice that artists today don't make sculpture like Michelangelo's anymore. And maybe even our most important creatives are not even artists, but perhaps visionary entrepreneurs. And so on the right, we have the notion of the networked self. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but two very different notions of what a human being is, both embedded in their times. So let's start by talking about creativity. And there's been a lot written about creativity today. You do a search and see all the books coming out. First thing we notice is that most of them are not about creativity. They're about mastery. So perhaps you've heard the 10,000 hours thing, that it takes 10,000 hours, which is roughly 10 years of dedicated practice, to master one's discipline. And in Malcolm Gladwell's discussion of this, he says that Mozart was not a particularly original musician until he had put in his 10,000 hours. His earlier work was derivative, and that the Beatles became such an important force in rock because they were stuck for so many years in Hamburg, Germany, and put in their time mastering their discipline. But does that really sound right to us? Was Mozart's great rival Salieri as equal to him as a musician when he put in his 10,000 hours? And yes, the Beatles put in all that time, but Elvis, the king, his best album was his first one, the Sun Recordings, and he had not put in any 10,000 hours. So maybe, yes, of course you have to master your discipline, but the question then is, what are the visionary insights that you are communicating through your discipline? And mastery does not explain that. Then there's innovation. So here's Dyson and one of his vacuum cleaners, and we recognize the importance of innovation to our economy today. We are respectful of innovators, but innovation is not creativity. Creativity is bringing forth something new of beauty or utility, and we then face a question of what's the difference between what we might call ordinary creativity of writing a law brief, preparing a well-conceived meal, writing an episode of a sitcom on the one hand, and visionary creativity on the other. And that's what we will be discussing. So creativity is not necessarily visionary creativity. So by visionary creativity, we're looking at a kind of creativity that is embedded in and at the same time remaking of its culture. And so if we think of the Baroque culture of uniform space and time of Isaac Newton. We see on the left Newton and his book Principia Mathematica, or of Einstein's relativity and the space-time, the flexible distortable space-time that it proposed. These are two very different worlds that these figures were not the only, but played a major role in creating. So their work was in the context of their cultures and was at the same time remaking of their cultures. Same thing in the arts. We have on the left Leonardo, and below him his Madonna of the Rocks. On the right, Salvador Dali, and below him Persistence of Memory, his Melting Watches. These are works that are embedded in their time, embedded in their culture, and at the same time remakes it. And that's what we're going to mean by visionary creativity. And it can happen in science, technology, and business as well. So on the left is Robert Noyce, founder of Intel and winner of the Nobel Prize, co-winner for development of the integrated microchip. And on the right, Steve Jobs and his Macintosh computer, both of which changed the world. So the visionary creative is one who realizes that our world is no longer what we have thought it to be, and a new world is struggling to be born. And visionary creatives are driven to bring this new world to all of us. So the work they create and the context they create in is a stage. By culture, we mean a stage on which we do our creativity and indeed on which we act out our lives. So this is a sketch by Leonardo da Vinci, and you see the linear logical perspective world of the Renaissance, and here that slide we saw a moment ago of Einstein's relativity, a very different world in the 20th century. And at the end of this talk we'll think a little bit about what is the nature of our emerging 21st century. So visionary creatives work in cultural context. The context, for example, the Renaissance, time of rebirth of humanism, borrowing from the classical worlds of Greece and Rome. So here in Botticelli's Birth of Venus, we have a depiction of not a Christian deity, but a pagan deity, and again the figure of the human being. Here in Galileo's book, the beginnings of what becomes fully crystallized in Newton's uniform space and time, and creating the world in which the stage on which the Renaissance is to act out its creativity and act out people's lives. You see again in Leonardo's sketch, and a human being emerging as a physical bodily thing as well as a spiritual thing. In again Michelangelo's David on the right is from Vesalius's book on anatomy. And here is Andrea Palladio's Villa Rotunda, and it is not a religious building but a villa. This one happens to be a weekend retreat, and so the dome here is not a heavenly dome but a humanist dome, and standing under the dome, standing in the center of this bilaterally symmetrical building, you are as though at the center of Cartesian XY coordinates, X, Y, and even Z, with the vertical from the dome. And so the slogan from Protagoras of the Greeks, man is the measure of all things, now borrowed by the Renaissance, and to measure you need a point of reference, a place to stand, and so the artworks of the Renaissance give you that reference. And the world they lived in was a mechanistic world. Here's an orrery, a model of the solar system. This is only the Earth and the Sun and the two inner planets, Mercury and Venus, and then the moon going around the Earth. But they conceived of and understood their world as very mechanical. In the 19th century, we have a very different sensibility emerging. Here's a Van Gogh wheat fields. And so this mechanical Newtonian world becomes replaced by one of fields, electromagnetic fields. So on the right are Faraday's and Maxwell's fields that are everywhere. They are the components of space and time. We eventually find out they generate around magnets. Light is an electromagnetic field. It is pervasive in our experience. And if you take a magnet and put a piece of paper over it and sprinkle iron filings on it, you get this pattern. And look at the dynamized quality of the space of this electromagnetic field. And that's the quality that Van Gogh is experiencing, is capturing in his painting, so that the cypress tree is like a flame licking the sky, and the moon and stars are each little nebulae swirling with energy. In the 20th century, we have a very different experience, a loss of all fixed frames of reference. We can maybe see it being launched with Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which he paints in response to Matisse's The Joy of Life. And so here we have a sharp, angular, primitive quality predictive of the coming cubism with shattered figures and shattered points of view. The space and time is now Einstein's from special and then general relativity. So there's no longer space and time are no longer a fixed potential that can be occupied by objects or events, but in fact each body, each cluster of matter, here the Earth, generates its own space-time in a state of continuous distortion. And in Picasso's Portrait of Vallard, a Cubist painting, we see the figure as though seen in a shattered mirror. There is no static given figure. There is no static point of view of the artist, but all is in motion. Time, too, as we see in Salvador Dali's Melting Watches in his Persistence of Memory painting, time is no longer a fixed uniform thing, but is bent to circumstances. And this firm exterior world that we had lived in forever previous to the 20th century is now shattered, and what's left of it becomes internalized. And this is the basis of Carl Jung. We see on the left his psychology, and a quote from Joseph Campbell, whom we see on the right: "The latest incarnation of Oedipus, the continued romance of Beauty and the Beast, stands this afternoon on the corner of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue waiting for the traffic light to change," so that these myths are no longer in a fixed past. They are no longer the fixed frames of reference of a Greco-Roman origin for our culture, but are rather internalized into each one of us. And we see this very powerfully in James Joyce's Stream of Consciousness, in his two great novels, Ulysses and then Finnegan's Wake. And so here's Joyce on the right, a sketch that he makes of Leopold Bloom, his character in Ulysses, where the chapters of the novel are modeled against the books of the Odyssey, and the figures, Leopold Bloom is Odysseus, his wife is Penelope, his son is Telemachus, so they have internalized these mythological characters. Now, how does the visionary creative go about bringing us this new world, changing the world? And we're now beginning to understand in the workings of consciousness that how the brain sets up preconceived patterns, and thoughts are sort of negotiating through those patterns. Well, for anything to really change, you have to change those patterns. So visionary creatives swim in the culture of their day and manifest in their work the spirit of their age. But at the same time, the things they create, and we don't have time to look at all of them, but this is true in art, design, science, technology, business. The things they create embody that spirit. But if that's all they did, things wouldn't go anywhere. You'd have a worldview or a spirit of the age. Artwork would be produced to conform to that, and it would remain static. But that's not what happens, because at the same time, the things that the visionary creative creates are a little bit off-center for us, somehow not what we expected. And they present a discontinuity, a difference between what we're anticipating and what is actually given to us that stretches us, restructures the cerebral cortex, restructures our consciousness, and pulls us into the future that the visionary creative is already living in, and is dumbfounded that no one else sees it, and are thereby driven to create works that will make what's apparent to them apparent to everyone. And so that discontinuity, we go to the gallery expecting an Impressionist painting by Monet, and we get a Cézanne, post-Impressionist painting. We go next season expecting post-Impressionism, and we get Cubism. We go again expecting Cubism, and there's a Marcel Duchamp urinal. We say, okay, we can handle that, and then we get a soup can. So we are continually, the artist is continually stretching us in this way. We go to the movies expecting a 2001 mythological presentation of a new space mythology, and we get in Star Wars a hero journey. And then we go again expecting a hero journey, and we get artificial intelligence, a exploration of love. So we continually are being pulled into our mind, our brain, our cerebral cortex is restructured for an emerging world that the visionary creative experiences. And this can be in art, in painting, in movies, but also in design, in business, and so the creative business person is just as much a visionary creative, or can be, as can be an artist. Now let's talk about becoming a visionary creative. What's the ideal education for our aspiring visionary creative? Well, we could look to psychologists, and they'll talk about all the wrong stuff. They'll talk about balance. They'll talk about, tests in which we ask, how many things can you think of to do with bricks, like make bookshelves? And none of this has anything to do with what truly creative figures are doing. So let's look at someone, a poetic philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, and in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there's a chapter called The Three Metamorphoses of the Spirit. And Nietzsche writes, Of the three metamorphoses of the spirits, I tell you, how the spirit becomes a camel, and the camel a lion, and the lion finally a child. So what is difficult? Asks the spirit that would bear much, and kneels down like a camel waiting to be loaded. What does Nietzsche mean here? Nietzsche means that you begin by taking on your culture, mastering your culture generally, the culture of your discipline, and the techniques of your discipline. So here mastery is quite an issue. Now, if that camel has been well loaded, he now becomes a lion. And the lion runs out into the desert. And if the load was substantial, it will be a particularly fierce lion. In the loneliest desert, however, the second metamorphosis occurs. Here, the spirit becomes a lion who would conquer his freedom and be master in his own desert. And the job of that lion is to slay a dragon. And on every scale of that dragon is written, "Thou shalt." Nietzsche writes, for the ultimate victory, he wants to fight with the great dragon. Thou shalt is the name of the great dragon. But the spirit of a lion says, I will. And on defeating the dragon, even a lion cannot create the new. What can the child do that even the lion cannot do? So the lion now becomes a child. The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a wheel rolling out of its own center, a first movement, a sacred yes. And so here, imagery from 2001, the star child reborn anew, a wheel rolling out of its own center. Now let's just look at one little example. Who can guess who this is? J.K. Rowling, right. So, J.K. Rowling had no idea what she was going to be doing with her life. And so she had no idea how to prepare herself, but she did read L'Amour d'Arthur, Mallory, T.H. White, The Once and Future King. She accumulates this background, but it can't be toward a known end. Steve Jobs says in his famous Stanford address, you cannot connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. So, kind of a wide range of preparation that we have to do, not knowing exactly what we are going to encounter. And then the alone time, all of the hours and days and months that Rowling spent at the Elephant House pub, thinking alone, not bothered, working on her great work. And this alone time, Isaac Newton was at Cambridge and had to leave due to the great plague, and went back to his home for 2 years, couldn't interact with people, could just sit there and think, and that's when his great theories came about. Buckminster Fuller, known for the geodesic dome, at 1922 his daughter died, young daughter, and he was devastated. For 1 year he did not speak, and this gave him the time to think through what he was going to do with his life. And in Rowling's case, it came out with a great journey for her and a great creation for us all, her Harry Potter series. And we can look at the biographies of artists in every field and see this pattern. Now, what's the motivation for the artist? What's the motivation for the visionary creative person in technology or business or art? And We are now inundated with happiness studies, books on happiness, measures of the gross national happiness, really inane, stupid stuff. And let's suggest that the figures we're interested in, let's ask about Alexander Pope, Beethoven, Nietzsche, Van Gogh, Solzhenitsyn. Were they happy? Do we care? Did they care? Was that what they were doing with their lives? Pope had a very difficult life. He was 4 feet 6 inches tall. He had tuberculosis of the bone. He was a hunchback. He was in physical distress his entire life. He was a Catholic, forbidden to be educated, forbidden to attend a university, forbidden to go in to live near London, and yet was one of the great poets of the English language. Beethoven, a difficult, struggling life, including his contemplation of suicide and finally a decision to reinvent himself as a romantic hero. Nietzsche, so ill that he had to drag himself to his writing table. Eventually, he could not. His eyes were so bad he could not read. He had to have people read to him, and he could only write a few lines a day of his books on saying yes to life. Van Gogh, who saw the world as a continuous religious experience and had such misery. I mean, people committing suicide, failed relationships, dejected by, never said what he sold, 3 paintings in his life. Solzhenitsyn, decades in concentration camps. Were they happy? No, but they were joyful. And what do we mean by that? Well, let's look at Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and his work in flow. Now, Mihai speaks about being in an experience where you're just totally absorbed. But that's not quite what we're looking about, because he's not really able to distinguish the flow of writing a great novel and the flow of playing a video game. Psychology today is just unable to grip, to be engaged with creative art. It has become so done in by its academic environment. So let's look at a few artists. And André Gide in The Immortalist, his character breaks free of his binding conventional life. He writes, the layers of acquired knowledge peel away from the mind like a cosmetic and reveal in patches the naked flesh beneath the authentic being hidden there. A movie like Wolf with Jack Nicholson, in which he is a meek editor being pushed out of his publishing company, and one night his car hits a wolf, and he gets out to look at the downed creature. It jumps up, bites him, and runs off. And of course, it was a werewolf. And so slowly he transforms. This energy wells up into him. He can see what's going on around him. He knows what he wants to do. And so imagine our visionary creative having that energy well up into them. Gasset Ortega writes, the political or cultural aspects of history are the mere surface of history. That, in preference to and deeper than these, the reality of history lies in biological power, in pure vitality, in what is in man of cosmic energy, not identical with, but related to, the energy that agitates the sea, fecundates the beasts, causes the tree to flower and the stars to shine. Imagine what it's like to be in touch with that energy, to feel that energy flowing through you, Campbell writes, myth is the secret opening through which the inexhaustible energies of the cosmos pour into cultural manifestations. Imagine being able to feel that energy pouring through you, being a vehicle for that energy. So, what were the joys of Van Gogh, Pope, Beethoven, Nietzsche, Solzhenitsyn, and others who had difficult lives? But it's not just difficult lives we're talking about here. Shakespeare, Haydn, Picasso, Twain, and others who had largely pleasant lives. What they experienced was they directly experienced the spirit of our age, the inexhaustible energies that others can only attempt to understand, and in response to the spirit and these energies, they produced work that were conduits for the flow of these energies into the world, and at the same time were vehicles for the remaking of the world. That is the joy of the visionary creative. That's the motivation of the visionary creative. And what greater satisfaction could there be? Van Gogh wrote in a letter to his brother Theo, wings, wings to fly above life, wings to fly above the grave and death. That is what we want, and I am beginning to understand that we can get them. Van Gogh's greatest unhappiness, his greatest misery, was not the difficulties of his life, but the religious vision that he had of the world, and his dissatisfaction that he was only partially able to convey it in his work. He had wished that he could have done more. Okay, so now to our aspiring creatives, our 21st century. What is our world like today? And what will be the new visionary creativity? Joseph Campbell wrote, what will be the new mythology? One cannot say any more than one can say what will be tonight's dream, as they both come from the same realm. But we can sort of look at what the stage on which our visionary creatives will be acting will be like. And Sir James Jeans, English astronomer and physicist, writes, the universe begins to look more and more like a great thought than a great machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather hail it as the creator and governor of the realm of matter. So very different worlds starting to appear. Remember that humanist self of Michelangelo versus the networked self. We have become very different human beings. Our creatives today are going to be working in very different contexts. We can think back on a lost literary world. And so Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, about which the Duke of Gloucester said, what, another of those damn fat, square, thick books, always scribble, 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 eh, Mr. Gibbon? And that kind of book. What is a book? A person spends years or maybe decades gathering their experience and then rendering it into a form that another individual self will be able to receive. The problem with the decline in books and literature, closing of bookstores today, is not, oh, well, we can get them online. It's that we're becoming different creatures, that we no longer are of that kind of experience, but rather an experience of integrated networks rather than isolated literate human beings. And so ecology, symbiogenesis, parallel universes, and social networks become important. We have a figure like John Bell on the right. And in 1934, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen published what's called the Epr Paradox. They didn't like quantum theory, and they finally said, look, if you accept the weirdness of quantum theory, which they thought was due to the fact it was incomplete and would go away when it was completed. And Einstein would keep posting challenges that Niels Bohr, who is the designated defender of quantum theory, would have to respond to. So they published the Epr Paradox, in which they said, if you accept this stuff that we don't like, you're going to have to accept the following, that if two particles can become what we now call entangled, if they separate across the universe, something happening to one, if we observe one of them, the other one will instantly respond. And that just doesn't make sense. And so people just sort of buried it. And in 1964, John Bell published what's called Bell's Theorem, in which he said, here's the test whereby, he took it seriously, and he said, here's how you test that, and sure enough, it is weird. And so no one else could really come to a grip with this, and Bell finally said, it's time to do this. He took some time off. He sat down and thought about it, he was Irish, visited some American universities, and then formulated Bell's theorem and showed that Einstein was totally wrong, and while he was at it, showed that Johnny von Neumann, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, had made fundamental errors in his work. And Lynn Margulies. So on the left is Charles Darwin, Darwin's theory of evolution, updated to what we call the modern synthesis, to incorporate what we know about genetics and mutations. And in the middle there is Stephen Jay Gould, who co-authored the theory of what's called punctuated equilibrium, that species do not change by the gradual processes that Darwin hypothecated, but rather in bursts, punctuated equilibrium. It's in equilibrium and then poof, something happens all of a sudden. And this is totally accepted, but he had no explanation for it. It's just a description. Well, Lynn Margulies said, you guys have it all totally wrong. The way evolution works is that genes move around. It's all one big network. It says all the species, when you stand back, you see them like the characters in a Seurat Pointillés painting, but when you go up close, it's all just bacteria and viruses moving around DNA. And the way evolution takes place is whole scale chunks of DNA are moved from one creature to another by bacteria and viruses. It's a theory called symbiogenesis. It's all one network. Well, evolutionary biologists just won't talk about it, but that's what appears to be really happening. On the right, we have an interesting figure, Hugh Everett III, who was a student at Princeton of John Wheeler. On the left, one of the most respected physicists of the 20th century, a teacher and mentor to great figures, supporters of them, but he didn't support Hugh Everett. Hugh Everett was interested in a phenomena where in quantum theory a particle can be in what's called superposition. It can be everywhere at once. And then when we observe it in a certain way, bang, it chooses where it's going to be. Like Schrodinger's cat that's in a box, neither dead nor alive until we look at it. And then it chooses whether it's going to be dead or alive. And of course, we don't want to pick on cats that way, but it's a famous thought experiment called Schrodinger's cat. Well, Hugh Everett says, well, how does it do that? How would the particle decide which path it's going to take? What do we mean by exiting superposition? This doesn't make sense. And he proposed that it stays in superposition. When it has to choose one path or another, it does. In a Yogi Berra-ism, it chooses both paths. The universe splits, and there's now two universes, one in which it took the left-hand path and one in which it took the right-hand path. And so this is called theory of parallel universes. And Wheeler forced Everett to so compromise his PhD thesis that it was meaningless. And Everett finally, in disgust, Wheeler did introduce him to Heisenberg, and Heisenberg said, this is junk. This guy knows nothing about what he's talking about. So Everett just in disgust left physics, and today you go to a large physics conference in which they're addressing these issues, ask for a show of hands of what interpretation do people accept of what's going on in quantum theory, and the vast majority will pick the multi-worlds or parallel universes theory of Everett's. So ask yourself, what in your field seems obvious to everyone else but seems somehow not right to you? Asking this might open a productive line of exploration, as it did for these figures. And if you embark on the path of the visionary creative, is success assured? Of course not. Or, to quote Dr. Seuss from his last book, Oh, the Places You'll Go, congratulations, today is your day. You're off to great places. You're off and away. Will you succeed? Yes, you will indeed. 98.75% guaranteed. Thank you.